Wonderful. Thanks for having me. And thanks, Sonia, for the great presentation. I think we share a lot of approach and topic, and I have a lot of opinions on rules as well. So I should have made my presentation about this. Yes, but yeah, like Sonia, I tried to really convey multiple layers and a whole vibe in visualizations, right? And not just stick with simple superficial stuff. And so I think it's always a challenge to get that right. It's always a new experiment. And today I want to share a few experiences, a few principles that for me have worked in the past. So obvious question, can you see the screen okay? Does it say beyond the bar chart?
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, cool. So thanks again for the invite. My name is Moritz Stefaner. I've been an independent data visualization expert, or how I like to call it, truth and beauty operator, for more than 15 years now. And I have had the privilege of working with organizations like World Economic Forum or OECD, lots of researchers also, like partners in academia, like Max Planck Society, but also companies. I also do self-initiated projects. I've been experimenting a lot and sort of looking at how can we expand the language of data visualization, how can we make it work in a good way for a lot of people. And we can start at the beginning. Why do we visualize data at all, right? And I think a typical answer is that for starters, we are surrounded by an increasingly number-heavy world. And numbers alone are hard to consume and require our full cognitive attention, and they're just overall very abstract and cold. And just to demonstrate that, you can see here 4 different data sets. So each color here is a data set with 2 rows with different values for X and Y. And if we run summary statistics, which we often use in science or in data science to find out what's the pattern or what's the overall message in a data set, you can see that in this case, the average, the variance, and the correlation are all identical, right? So from that lens of aggregate statistics, these data sets are pretty much identical. But if we visualize them, and that's the exciting part, of course, now for us, we can see they're not identical at all. They all have very different overall shapes and characters, and have probably been created by very different processes. And for me, the point is really each of these charts invites a whole set of different questions and hypotheses. Like we start to think about what we see in the charts in terms of why does it look the way it does? And we don't do that if we just get the mean and the variance, right? And so I think the big promise we make as data visualization practitioners is that we invite the sense making and the discussion and these active processes. And also at the same time that we really show the forest, like the big patterns and the big picture, but also all the little trees that make up such a totality without show the patterns, but also the individuals, right? I think that's very much at the heart of our philosophy and profession, this idea. Sometimes it works better, sometimes it works worse, but I think that's what fascinates a lot of us also. Now, practically, do we harness this potential that data visualization can have? Well, often in companies, I see these kinds of dashboards where you just have huge numbers, and then there's a little line next to it, or there's a circle around it, a little donut chart just to make it look nice. And I think often these are just glorified numbers. Like the numbers are the thing that's the star here, and people just put a chart around it so it looks even more important, right? And to me, that's not really harnessing the power of data visualization, right? This is just forest from an altitude of a few thousand miles too high, right? It's just like flying way too high. You don't see any of the actual underlying phenomena that make up the number. If you then complain and say like, well, wait, I wanted to see all these beautiful trees, then you get these applications with like 10,000 filters and drop downs, and nobody knows their way around anymore. And it's a big mess and everybody's overwhelmed and confused, right? That approach is sort of this, here's all the data, good luck, you asked for it, here you have it. Yeah. And I think we have that quite a bit. And that's also why everybody's struggling with data so much, is that we either get one or the other, but we never get that nice middle ground of really well-crafted data experiences that make sense for a specific data set, that are fit to purpose, that are still open. They don't like tell you what to think. It's still like open and exploratory, but it's made for a specific purpose. And this is something I really am after in my work a lot. And it's again, it's a process. It's never off the shelf or one shot, or it's really hard to sort of formulate rules in that case, but you really need to craft it. It's a process of making things, right? But I think from my perspective, that's really key, that the sense making with data requires us to think about the languages we create, the languages we use to talk about specific data sets, because only then we can actually change how we think about data and the underlying phenomena. And again, this will only work if you accept that decorating numbers or throwing data at people is not enough overall. So here's 4 different principles I'll show you, and I'll illustrate with a few examples that I think work if you go for that type of crafting data experiences approach. The first one is really acknowledging that a reality is complex and multi-layered, and that great visualizations, to me, embrace the complexity and nuance in the data. And often you hear good visualization tells a story. My opinion is excellent data visualization tells 1,000 stories, actually. But the key is not to tell them all at once, right? So you still need some structure and some guidance and some mental vehicles that help you navigate that complex landscape, right? So again, you can't just throw complex stuff at people. You need to somehow have them find a way into it. And for instance, metaphors can work great for that. So here's an example, a project I've been working on already 10 years ago, crazily, where the OECD commissioned me together with the agency Raureif in Berlin to create a new visualization for the Better Life Index they came up with. The OECD is typically known for really thick books with many tables and many bar charts, mostly blue. So they do the PISA ranking and all the different, like all kinds of different indices and measurements about countries. But usually, again, it's very statistical, right? Now, for this project, they said themselves that they want to challenge this paradigm because the project was about the whole fact that there's a lot of things you can look at in a country that you could compare. So it's multidimensional by nature. But also that your priorities might be different, right? For some people, safety might be more important, for others, community or jobs or health, right? So this idea that things are multi-layered but also personal was actually at the heart of the process of the project. And so, yeah, they said, let's find a visual that captures that. And so we came up with this flower visualization, where for each country we have a flower, the length of the petals represents the scores in these different dimensions. And so you can do these overall arrangements. But the other important part, of course, as I said, is the idea of personalization and interaction, because everybody has different preferences and views. And that's why you can experiment here with the weightings on that page. And you can start with all topics being equally important. But if you, for instance, prioritize civic engagement, then Australia and Sweden rise to the top. And if you then bring income back into the mix, United States and Luxembourg catch up and so on. So the visual directly captures what you are doing in the visualization, sort of transforms and adapts and expresses what you have been looking for, basically. And the funny thing is, suddenly people are in the process of exploring a really high dimensional, complex data space. You know, there's lots of linear algebra happening, like with all the rankings and weights and whatnot. But you don't notice because it's embedded in that metaphor, right? And it's really interesting, I think, you can do fairly complex multidimensional stuff if you have this really characteristic, inviting design that's also playful and personal, and then suddenly you can do really complex things, and people don't mind, sort of, or are even excited to explore some of the complexity in the data set. The other thing is this really iconic design. It's not really precise, and here we are back at the rules and the objectives. It's really hard to read, actually, right? But it's so iconic visually and so recognizable that it became sort of an icon for a whole new trend in the organization, a whole new view of how we deal with information and data, and it becomes a logo or an icon of sorts if you have such a characteristic visual. And that's sort of interesting that this visual metaphor can become this vehicle for a bigger thought, basically, and you can refer to it. And now all the new initiatives here in the front is something from Interactive Things. They launched later. It's always presented against this backdrop of the Better Life Index, which is huge there in the halls of the organization, which I'm sort of proud of. So that concludes my first point. I think it's really important to care for the complexity and nuance in the data, but you also need to make it digestible, give it structure, allow for personal perspectives. And often I say, as a designer, your role is first, you're the data detective, like you lift every rock, you look everywhere, you know, you do all the hard work. But then in the final scene of the movie, you know, you do this beautiful like unveiling of, oh, this is how it all comes together, right? So then you become more the tour guide in a sense. And you can do that well because you know your way around, but then you can make an attractive, scenic route through the data in a way. So that's this point. Don't think too much about storytelling, but maybe world telling is the more exciting perspective. The second one, we touched on it already, is it's not just enough to show complexity, but somehow you have to make it manageable, tangible, and altogether easier to digest. And here we took it actually literally, because in the data cuisine workshop series that I do together with Susanne Jaschko, we explore if food can be a medium for information, right? And to find that out, we team up with local chefs and workshop participants in different cities in order to tell local data stories through local food, actually. So that's the sort of the premise of the whole thing. And the way it works is it's a 2-day workshop. We come there with a few data sets prepared and discuss them with the participants. Also, participants bring ideas for data stories and we discuss them together. Then people sketch ideas for dishes that could express this data as food. And then we try them out in a kitchen. So we rent a kitchen and make the dishes and present them really nicely, of course. And then at the end, there's always the big data dinner or data buffet where we share the creations, everybody tastes it. And that's actually when the visualization happens, right? When you taste it. So we document it through photos, but the visualization event is basically when people actually share the food and discuss it, right? And that's always a big thing when you see everything come together. And so just so you get a sense of what people produce there. So here, for instance, we have 4 different gin tonics that represent how many people live close to a nuclear reactor in Belgium, and the more of these little beads you have there in the gin tonic, which are these sort of, it's sort of hard to explain, but this technique where you can make little spheres out of liquids, and it looks like cooling rods, obviously, right? So the more of that you have in your glass that looks like a cooling rod, the more people live close to nuclear power plants in Belgium. Another dish looked at the amount of miles the ingredients had to travel. So they arranged these 4 different desserts in the room according to the distance. And that tapioca thing on the very right is like super exotic ingredients was basically in the next room. So you had to walk quite a bit to even get it, right? So it was this idea of you have to travel because the food had to travel. Other participants thought about, well, what happens when the bees disappear, right? Who does their work? And they concluded, well, then we have to do the work. And so they left the dessert unfinished because if the bees are missing, they cannot pollinize the dessert anymore. So you have to do it yourself. Well, this idea of leaving something broken by design is really nice. And one of my favorite outcomes is this set of death by chocolate pralines that visualizes the statistics of causes of death in Belgium in this form of small coffins. And Além, the designer, she made 1 per participant, basically. And so it was a little lottery in a sense that everybody had to draw one and then you see what you get, basically, which is sort of morbid, but also really interesting in a sense that it's a bit what's going on. It's an interesting way to look at risk, basically. And you might say, oh, this is really tedious, you know, so you spend so much time and effort to just represent like 5 numbers. But I think that's exactly the point. And so it's really this counter approach to showing a lot of data really quick. It's like showing really small data sets and in a very deep and elaborate way and really meditate on them. And also bringing them in a social setting and using them as a catalyst for conversation and using them to start something rather to end something, right? So these dishes are in a way starting points and very memorable and a starter for conversation rather than a definite answer to anything. You might say, Moritz, that's all very nice, but I can't cook the sales figures or dance perform them now every week, right? I have a job to do. But let me show you how this basic idea can also be transferred to other contexts, right? It's all about the philosophy. So here's just a quick example. So we worked on the German vaccination dashboard. I did that together with Studio 9, an agency in Berlin. And we visualized the vaccination statistics in Germany. And overall, the dashboard was very straightforward, very like no nonsense. Here's the numbers, make sure everybody can access it, very accessible and so on, because we knew, okay, everybody in Germany needs to get this information, right? But we had one really playful and fun element, and that's this vaccination clock. And the vaccination clock was a means to say, what's the current speed of vaccination right now, right? The daily speed. So if all the vaccinations on a day were spread out exactly evenly, right? What speed would that clock have? Like how many do we do per minute, per second? And it's a simple number. It's just one number, but by visualizing it day by day through that clock, people had a visceral sense of the speed and were able to somehow relate to that at a scale that makes sense. That we know from personal life, right? So we are not used to dealing with hundreds, thousands or millions or something like this. So sometimes you forget, was it a billion or was it a million? Was it 100 million? You know, these numbers are so far away, but as soon as something is on people scale, you know, like, oh, it's almost like a normal clock, but a bit faster or a bit slower, we suddenly have a much better sense of, has it changed since yesterday or not, right? And this, and also the emotional role that this plays, in the sense that this signaled to people there's constantly something happening. And that was at the beginning of the pandemic very important, that people had a sense there's progress finally, right? And so there's also this emotional aspect to a design like this that sort of, again, transports something between the lines. So that's this idea really of bringing things to human scale, making more rich, sensual, and again, connect to everyday experiences. It can be very powerful and can be very simple also in some cases. My third point is, and that's something I really, really stress also when I work with a client, is that we need to be humble in a way and not think too much about what we want to do, but really be open to what we can learn by looking at the data in depth, and also by learning from the people that should use the tool or that we want to address with our communication, right? And I think understanding really data and users or your audience really well is often the key to then having a much stronger visualization in the end, or not losing a lot of time in your own mind, basically, and exploring all the possible wrong directions you could take with a project. And this is super applied. Peak spotting project is a good project or a good example here. I think it's something we did for Deutsche Bahn or are still working on. It's the German railway, and we help them understanding the passenger flows and how to make the trains more evenly loaded, so that not some of them are super empty, others are super full, but more equal spread of passengers. And for that, we actually did look very closely at how people work currently and what they want to achieve, what tools they use, what the overall landscape is. And one of the parts where we were like, this is interesting, is when we saw some of the work was still done on paper, because that tells us, there's sort of a gap here, right? So they need to bridge something between two tools, or there's a gap in visualization that they were not able to fill. And here on a really stressful day, we saw they printed out all the train lines and marked all the critical sections in orange and in green. And so we knew, okay, because there must be some, they're used to this type of diagram, which is kind of unusual outside the railway business, and B, there's an opportunity here in terms of extra tooling. And so we took this, sort of built a first prototype in Tableau. That's another thing, is this early prototyping and really exploring your data soon. And it actually made it into the final tool on the right-hand side pretty much unchanged, because it just worked, right? But we wouldn't have dared maybe to do it if we hadn't seen already them using it in a preliminary form. And so exploring what works from the data side, but also from the people side, is, I think, closely tied to prototyping and iterative design. So we do a lot of really simple, throwaway prototypes, test them with people, and sort of slowly approach our way, you know, with really like more crude stuff towards more refined application. And then once you have a principle going and then the basic framework, then you can build out all the different views and understand, hey, how could we make this now make work even better and so on. But to develop this basic language and your basic perspective, and also understand how complex or how simple you want to be, it's really important to do this testing and prototyping. The other thing we do quite extensively is track user behavior. So we built even a visualization in the backend to visualize the user sessions. So we were able to see, oh, people spend like this long and then they do this action and that action. So it's like a little musical notation almost we have. It's a bit extensive, but because it was a completely new tool, we really wanted to see how it's being used. And in this case, for instance, we've seen that black dots are all search events. So although we built all these amazing visualizations, there is a bunch of users that just use the search, like Google for trains, basically. And so we wouldn't have known that. But now that we knew that, we said, okay, cool. Then we can make a little version of our app that is actually just a quick search for trains, right? And nobody told us this was needed, but it's actually something we found just by observing users that they sort of misused our tool. And so we said, okay, that's great. Yeah, well, we'll make it even easier now to misuse it. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's this idea really, step back a bit from you. You don't have to come up with everything. If you just explore the data well and explore your audience well, maybe you don't need to be that creative in the end. And then the solutions really fall into place often quite nicely. It's more a discovery rather than invention. And the final point is a short one, but a really important one. We should always prioritize the truth over the data. So in principle, all data is always incomplete, biased, imperfect. I think we just have to accept it. That's the way it is. But that doesn't mean all data is bad. Some data is still closer to the truth than others, right? And our job as data visualization experts is really to show the right perspective, the one people should see. And so to me, more and more over the years, I realized, yeah, it's really, you need to think and act like a journalist, really, and not like a salesman or an entertainer or an engineer, but you have to have the codex of a journalist to say, like, I'm learning something here. I want to make sure people learn the right thing now from my experiences, right? And I think that's really important. And really the powerful thing that data visualization can do is so nicely illustrated here, I think, by Scott McCloud. He talks about frames in comics, really, and he says, this frame, this is the device by which you can grab the reader by the shoulder, guide them to the right spot, tell them you're here, now look there, right? And I think that's the powerful thing data visualization can do as well, is to establish that frame and that view and that perspective. And we should take it serious and do it right. And that's my main point here, I guess. So yeah, these are my 4 points. I hope they helped a bit. And that's it from me for today.